there was a response to the Protestant Reformation within the Catholic Church, and this we refer to as the Counter-Reformation. Some scholars prefer the name Catholic Reformation to stress that this wasn't merely a response to Protestantism, right? It was also a response to those who wanted to stay in the Catholic Church but wanted to make changes. So I think both are true. In some sense, this was a reaction to Protestantism, but it was also just a response to those who wanted to reform the church from within and not break it up and split it up. There was a council held to give a voice to those who wanted to reform the church from within, and we call this the Council of Trent. It took place in Trent from 1545 to 1563, and several things were ironed out at the Council of Trent. In essence, the Catholic Church dug its heels in as far as its doctrines. There were many who agreed that there were abuses in the leadership of the church, and steps were taken to remedy those abuses. There was a general feeling that Catholics in the pew, lay people, needed to be better educated on Catholic doctrine, especially with the threat of Protestantism spreading. So there were steps taken to teach people, lay people, about the doctrines of the faith, of the Catholic faith, to a greater degree. But ultimately, as far as doctrine, the Catholic Church didn't change any of its doctrines, its teachings. In fact, they said this about Protestantism, about the chief teaching of Protestants, which was salvation by grace alone. This was one of the decrees of the Council of Trent. If anyone says that the sacraments of the new law are not necessary unto salvation, but superfluous, if anyone says that without them or without the desire thereof, men obtain of God through faith alone the grace of justification, through all the sacrament, though all the sacraments are not indeed necessary for every individual, if anyone says these things, let him be cursed or anathema or excommunicated. So this was a common formula for basically pronouncing a curse on anyone who didn't agree with what the authoritative church was saying. So the leaders at the Council of Trent said, no, we're not saved, as the Protestants say, we're not saved by grace alone, through faith alone. And the Catholic Church would give more emphasis to the teaching in James, the book of James. And of course, they put their own twist on it, which had been developed over centuries through the Middle Ages. And I'll talk more about their view of salvation in a minute. The little inset here is Ignatius of Loyola. He was a very interesting person, a former soldier who founded a new monastic order called the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The Jesuits were different from any other monastic order in that they were organized. Loyola organized them to be kind of soldiers for Christ, and not to stay in a monastery, not even to have to say those canonical hours, those praying 8 times a day, but to be ready to go out into the world and evangelize on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church and to combat Protestant teaching everywhere they could, whether as missionaries to Protestant countries or just to take the Catholic faith to new places like the Far East, to China and Japan, where some Jesuits went. One of the tenets of the Jesuit order was absolute total obedience to the Pope. So they were in many ways the vanguard of the Counter-Reformation, one of the sharpest weapons in the hands of the Catholic Church in responding to the threat of Protestantism. Moving on, of course, from 1500 to really 1650, even 1700, there are great efforts by European powers to explore and colonize new parts of the world that were discovered. At first, there were explorations into Africa, India, into the Far East. But then after Columbus and others find the Americas, there are great efforts made to colonize those places and to exploit those places in all their economic resources. So many of the efforts of Spain and Brazil and Britain and France and the Netherlands were economically motivated, right? And unfortunately, as part of that, these European powers discovered the resource of African slaves, which they used for the next 300 years. The first slave ship traveled in 1518 on behalf of the Portuguese to the Caribbean, and slaves were used there to harvest sugarcane. Over the next 300 years, as many as 10 million Africans would be transported to the Americas in what's called the triangular slave trade. In general, usually Indians, indigenous peoples, were exploited by these settlers, although there were exceptions. The Spanish had a system called the encomienda system, which was basically where the Spanish settlers would use the labor of the indigenous peoples and would give them some benefits, but in many ways it was a parent-child relationship, and the indigenous peoples were not treated with a lot of dignity. But there were people like Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Dominican friar. First, he was supportive of the encomienda system, but eventually he came to believe that it was unjust, and he advocated on behalf of the Indians in the Americas, and even later on behalf of African slaves, and tried to see that their rights were protected. He was somewhat successful. They were granted some rights, some protections, but not a whole lot. But there were some Christian voices like his advocating on behalf of those who were being exploited. There were Protestant settlements as well. The first was in the Americas, was in Jamestown, Virginia. There were also two famous episodes, the settlements in Massachusetts and Connecticut. The first was in 1620 with a group we call the Pilgrims. They were actually separatists. They wanted no affiliation with the English church, and they settled in Plymouth, started Plymouth Colony. The second group came 10 years later in 1630 and settled in Massachusetts Bay, and we call them the Puritans. They were not separatists. They're the ones that wanted to be an example to the folks back home. They wanted to live as members of the Church of England, but to live in such a way and with such religious purity that they would be an example to Anglicans back in England. So some difference between their approaches there. Sadly, there was poor treatment of the indigenous peoples practiced, and of African slaves practiced by settlers of New England and the colonies, 13 colonies. But again, there were voices from early on, who advocated for their protection. One of the most notable was Roger Williams, who originally was going to settle in the Puritan colonies of Massachusetts, but he was kicked out because of some of his beliefs. So he founded Rhode Island, and he was one of the earliest advocates for letting people believe what they want, the right of conscience. He also advocated for fair treatment of Indians, making treaties with Indians rather than simply taking their land. But there were others. The Quakers, who I'll talk about in a minute, were also, generally, they did not keep slaves, and they sought to be at peace with the Indians and make fair treatments with them. Fair treaties with them. So Mennonites, Quakers, and Roger Williams and some other groups would advocate for better treatment of these peoples who were colonized or used. All right, I need to mention the 30 Years' War. This took place between 1618 and 1648, and it involved several powers within Europe. It was almost like World War Zero. First, it had sort of a religious aspect to it. It was Protestants fighting Catholics in what's now Germany, which was then the Holy Roman Empire. But by the time it's over, it's also a dispute between the French and the family known as the Habsburgs, who had held the dominion of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire for a few generations. So this involved several different nations. It dragged on. It led to destruction of agriculture, to hundreds of thousands of deaths. And the results of the 30 Years' War ultimately was that several of these European powers were weakened, and many people became fatigued and exasperated over religious wars. They saw the futility of trying to establish one uniform religion in a state or in an area by force. And this will plant the seeds of, among other things, this will plant the seeds of Enlightenment ideas. The idea that perhaps human beings, one, should be allowed to believe what they want. Two, that perhaps by using human reason, people can come to ideas about God that all can agree on, regardless of how one reads the Bible or how one treats tradition. Those are Enlightenment ideas. So the 30 Years' War was very devastating. All right, the First Great Awakening. This is the revival in our title. Sometimes this is just called the Great Awakening. Some people call it the First Great Awakening because there will be other great revivals. This was a revival movement that gained speed both in the colonies, 13 colonies, and in the British Isles and a couple other pockets of Europe. The main figures in this revival were three men: Jonathan Edwards, who was a brilliant Reformed theologian and revival preacher from the Puritan communities of Massachusetts. He was a preacher. He took part in spreading this revival. He also observed it and analyzed it, and he wrote about his observations in a few different treatises. One you see here, The Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. So he used his very sharp analytical mind to try to analyze what was happening. There were a lot of crazy things going on, a lot of unusual behavior that people observed among those who heard preaching and were converted. And Edwards tried to make sense of it for people in his books. He basically concluded that the best way to tell if someone is truly converted is to look at their behavior and their what he called their affections. If they love the things that God loves and their behavior has changed, they're loving God and they're loving other people, they're showing the fruit of the Spirit, then he said, you know that they've experienced a true conversion. The biggest, most popular figure in the Great Awakening was an Englishman named George Whitefield, and he had attended Oxford with the third figure in the movement, which is John Wesley. They had been part of what was called the Holy Club there. And Whitefield traveled to the colonies from England several times and traveled up and down the colonies preaching in the open air to thousands and thousands of people. Became very popular. He was the most widely published and read author during this period of history because his sermons were published, and people just flocked to hear him. He had an unusual gift for projecting his voice and eloquently preaching salvation to huge groups of people. And then I mentioned John Wesley. He actually stayed in the British Isles. He was an Anglican priest who ended up leaving the Church of England to found a movement we called Methodism, which is now the Methodist Church. He was very, very reluctant to leave the Church of England, to be a schismatic, to start anything new. But through the efforts of John and his brother Charles, who was a great hymn writer, they started new classes of folks who gathered for Bible study and discipleship. He was a great outdoor preacher. His friend George Whitefield had urged him to go outdoors, preach to crowds outdoors. And after he started doing so, he experienced huge success in getting audiences and seeing conversions. So let me talk about just a few of the effects of this movement, this Great Awakening, as it's called. One of the results was a division between more traditional Protestants who were focused on more formal church membership and more ritualistic worship, between those and the people who had responded to a lot of these outdoor revival events. A lot of Protestants now were more focused on cultivating a vibrant personal faith rather than whether they were a member of any particular church or the traditional rituals of the church. Another effect was there was great cooperation between Protestants of many different denominations. And so there was a new feeling that there were similarities between these groups that transcended their differences, their smaller doctrinal differences. And of course, that's not to say there's a lot more interest in religion and Christian faith in the colonies and in the British Isles after this. The Enlightenment is the name we give to a movement in philosophy and learning that was kind of centered in France in the 1700s, but it also affected other parts of Europe and the United States. And it was characterized by a focus on, sort of like the Renaissance, a focus on the individual and the rights of individuals to believe what they want and to follow their own conscience. This is in large part the inspiration behind the United States Declaration of Independence, which talks about inalienable rights, rights that are believed, it's believed that all humans possess these rights. So it was a movement to affirm the rights of the individual, of religious tolerance as well. In France itself, there was some anti-religious sentiment. So not just a tolerance of religion, but a rejection of religion. One of the notable features of the French Enlightenment movement was the publication of the Encyclopedia. And this was just a gathering of knowledge, all that could be found out from the study of various subjects. This was not a project that was supervised by the church or church authorities. So there was a feeling that it was an independent learning movement. One of the effects of the Enlightenment was the adoption of what we call deism. It's kind of a pared down belief in God that can be deduced simply from reason. You don't need a Bible, you don't need a Quran, you don't need any religious book to come up with the conclusions of deism. It's just a kind of bare belief in a God, not a belief in Trinity. It's just a belief that there is a God, he did make everything. Along with it is the idea that God has put everything in motion in the universe. And the universe and all that's in it is sort of like a watch that's been wound up, and now it's running just as God intended it to. He doesn't involve himself. He doesn't intervene in the world. He just watches it benevolently, right? So the idea was that these were ideas that anyone could conclude just using their human reason. Some of the founding fathers of the United States were deists. They had these feelings, and the appeal of deism was that it wasn't dependent on any religious tradition or, again, any sacred writings. And it was something that people all over the world could theoretically agree on and advocate, and not disagree and be violent with each other. One of the products of Enlightenment thinking was the very modern new projects of the United States and the new vision of France that was birthed in the French Revolution. So the American and French revolutions are expressions of these Enlightenment ideas. A rejection of the old powers of monarchies. In France, even a rejection of the church and all its power. In France, much more than in Britain or America, the church leadership had been affiliated with the nobility and the monarchy. So that a rejection of monarchy for the French was also, by consequence, a rejection of the leadership of the church there. It's only fair to finish with those events because they're expressions of the Enlightenment in these new ways of thinking. One interesting thing that occurred in the United States, the brand new United States, as a result of the American Revolution, was what we call disestablishment. And this was the separation of churches from state endorsement. During the time of the 13 colonies, some of the states had official churches. So the Church of England would be the official church of, say, Georgia, the colony of Georgia. Well, after the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of the United States, independent of Britain, these state churches are disestablished. They're cut loose from state sponsorship. And that sort of brings us almost to a very modern view of church and state. The fact that no state should sponsor any single church. And that's one of our amendments, right? It's the government will not sponsor any single church.